to what I'm going to say. I've given this speech quite a lot of times, but those of you who may have seen it before will know that I rewrite it every time. Except that recently I gave it in Shropshire, Southampton, Bristol, and the constant theme was that I was talking about historical revisionism, and people were saying that I wasn't telling them enough about what it was that was being revised. And so today I'm going to make it a slightly longer speech, if you'll bear with me, because I need to talk about the war and the outcome of that, so that revisionism makes more sense. So I want to look at, I'm going to divide the presentation into three. And I'm going to look at World War II and try and get a sense of perspective and what occurred. And then I'm going to look at Holocaust denial and historical revisionism and how they've changed, and say a few words about conspiracy theory. And then finally, round off with what we can do about it. So firstly, some definitions. In the context that I'm going to talk about, historical revisionism is the revising of the history of the causes and outcome of World War II. But of course, history is always being revised because it's political and it's the result of class struggle and reflects the balance of class forces. But it's also linked to time and geography. So much of the debate about historical revisionism forgets that, for example, China, Vietnam, and Korea also have to struggle against revisionism with the role of the Japanese. And even earlier last year, in the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, came under significant attack, as does Cromwell. So there's a kind of constant to and fro about the history. So to be clear, what we're going to talk about is the war in Europe. And in our context, historical revisionism aims to rewrite history so that the victor and the vanquished share the same legacy. It's effectively a way of rewriting the outcome of the Nuremberg trials and the UN laws on genocide and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they kind of all hang together. Holocaust denial is the attempt to erase from history the core feature of fascism in order to dust it off and prettify it for modern recycling. And conspiracy theory plays on both. In 1945, there was some hope that historical revisionism wouldn't take place. And the part of the rationale behind the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials was to so expose what had taken place that everybody would simply accept it and find a way of moving on. General Eisenhower, after liberating one Nazi concentration camp, said, "The things I saw beggar description. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." But we know there's no such thing as a line in the sand where history is concerned. And so in many ways, we're now in that space that Eisenhower was worried about. To the point that today, Holocaust denial and historical revisionism are accepted at the level of government policy. The theories that there was a double genocide is government policy or is seriously challenging for it in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary, Romania, the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, Austria, the Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. In Germany, the truth holds, but there's a party, the AfD, that thinks that Nazism and death camps should be put behind them. They are in the official opposition. And in America, Holocaust revisionism has become weaponized in the struggle against Russia, to the point where a United Nations motion condemning Nazism, America was one of only 2 countries in the world that voted against it, even though they'd fought against the Nazis. And it was because the motion was being proposed by the Russians. So this is kind of the extent of the battle that's facing us. And it shows, I think, how much water has gone under the bridge, and the left is a long way behind where we actually are now. Still talking about the National Front, the BNP, about Tommy Robinson, when in fact supporters of Hitler have power over policy across large swathes of Europe. So to look at World War II and try and get a sense of perspective on it, which was my first challenge. When we talk about World War II, we're really starting in World War I and the revolutions that came out of it and the creation of the Soviet Union, followed by the Civil War and terrible famines. But the borders and the boundaries of Europe were set by war and revolution. And they could never just freeze as they were. In fact, they were challenged immediately. So the proponents of historical revisionism, for example, state that the German-Soviet Pact of Non-Aggression, which led to the division of Poland, was the precursor to war, when in fact the Soviets had been at war constantly since 1931 in the East against Japan. In fact, many of the most famous commanders of the Red Army in the Second World War cut their teeth in the decade of the Russian-Japanese War to the east. Interestingly enough, Time magazine saw it slightly differently. In 1938, by the way, despite what he wrote in Mein Kampf, Time magazine awarded Hitler Man of the Year award and put him on the cover. In 1939, they put Stalin on the cover and called him Man of the Year. But that was because they recognized that the German-Soviet Pact had driven Stalin, in their words, to take measures against an easy attack. And the latest correspondence that's been published between Mussolini and Hitler has Mussolini denouncing Hitler for moving away from the principles of fascism by doing an alliance with the Soviet Union. Well, of course, it wasn't an alliance, it was non-aggression pact. But you can see from the left and from the right, people were quite clear that this was the Soviet Union acting to protect itself. Of course, a pact is completely unnecessary if Europe wasn't already divided. And part of the responsibility for the division of Europe comes back to us in Britain, with the policy of Chamberlain seeking to weaken the Soviets by strengthening fascism. Chamberlain was a leading supporter of Franco. Britain was the dominant force in the fascist regime of Salazar in Portugal, and Mussolini was considered an ally, a close ally, right into 1940. Some of you may have seen the latest Netflix program about Chamberlain, and he's constantly holding out his relationship with Mussolini as a way of trying to persuade Hitler not to go to war. So if you want a culprit for World War II, you don't look at the German-Soviet Pact of Non-Aggression. You look at the policies of appeasement and the sham of non-intervention. And in fact, Chamberlain was the villain of the piece. Some of the myths that are raised about historical revisionism and Holocaust denial. Well, many in the British cabinet, like Halifax and Lord Simon, were prepared to do a deal to protect the empire. They argued in cabinet against Churchill for peace moves right in the middle of Dunkirk. And they thought that when the Soviets were attacked in June 1941, in their own words, that they wouldn't last more than 6 weeks. That was, by the way, exactly Hitler's calculations. He thought the same. But of course, they did last. Britain's to prepare empire, as was his throughout the 30s. Some have argued that Stalin was surprised by Hitler at Barbarossa. And that is something that is a valid discussion. It's a very complicated area. The extent of the border between the countries was absolutely enormous. There were very few natural impediments to invasion. And when he did invade, Hitler's force was 7 times bigger than Napoleon's. So I'm not quite sure how you stop that. But you could also argue, were the Americans any better prepared at Pearl Harbor, or the French when Paris fell, or particularly indeed the British when they were marooned and outflanked at Dunkirk, when they lost Greece, when they lost Crete, or when they ignominiously were kicked out of Singapore? They say that Stalin did not care about how many died, but in fact, the average daily death rate of troops on the Eastern Front in the World War II was pretty much identical to that of World War I. So that's an interesting point to consider. They say that Hitler didn't know about the Holocaust, but that is now disproven during the Lippstadt libel case in 2000. People often focus on the Wannsee Conference as evidence that Hitler didn't know about the Holocaust, but there's a smoking gun which comes from a recorded and stenographic report of a Himmler speech in October 1943, which did appear at Nuremberg. And in it, he says, "I did not consider myself justified to exterminate the Jews, but to let their children grow up only to become avengers. It had to be taken to have this people disappear from the face of the earth." Okay, you can't really get clearer than that, can you? Historians Martin Gilbert and Anthony Beaver have both pointed out that people underestimate how near to extinction we got. Certainly the number of Jews has never recovered, by the way. There's still more in the 30s than there are now. If the British had not won at El Alamein, the Germans were under direction to drive straight to Palestine. So that's how close they actually came. Some of you might not be aware, because the Holocaust has become this Schindler's List kind of thing. In fact, is much more nuanced. Some of you might not be aware that over 1 million Jews were killed between 1939 and 1941 in the East. And yet the Wannsee Conference that people say organized the Holocaust happened in January 1942. This was called the Holocaust of the Bullets. It was done before the gas chambers, and it was done largely by educated people within the laws and the orders of the time, and using local collaborators. I don't know if any of you have read the very popular Philippe Sands books, but it's extraordinary how many of the leading Nazi Gauleiters, the regional barons, were lawyers, for example. So these weren't people that had come out of nowhere. They were the educated Nazi elite. And the Holocaust was run on pretty much on capitalist lines, if not its values. For example, it was at Wannsee, the discussion said, underlined, that it was specifically designed to break even. In fact, one year made 167 million Reichsmarks profit. Death was made to pay for itself. The period up to 1939 was about expropriation of property and business. My family's home in Frankfurt was stolen, but we got it back after the war. My cousins got it back. It's not just about factories, it's about people's very existence. After 1942, it became about the question of recycling and the sale of body parts, if that's not too heavy for a Sunday afternoon. People were used, their bodies were used to make glue on an industrial scale, by the way, on an industrial scale, or lampshades. Their teeth were extracted. Their hair was used for pillows. Their spectacles were sold off. Medical experiments were conducted. This was a business. Interestingly enough, the number of full-time employees was actually very low, as so much of the work was outsourced, but to slave labor. Treblinka was responsible for the deaths of up to 900,000 people, but only had 20 full-time employees. Some say Hitler accelerated the Holocaust because he was losing. So how then do you account for this period up to 1942 and the millions murdered when he was winning? What Wannsee Conference did was agree a formula of concentration, ghettoization, deportation, and murder, because before that it had been decided regionally. Now, the war was not against Jews, but it was the principal war aim of Nazism. There were in effect two wars. There was one in the West, which was fought on the basis of the Geneva Convention. And then there was another in the East, which was a radicalized war against what Hitler called Judeo-Bolshevism, where no rules applied. In the West, 98% of British prisoners of war returned to Britain. In the East, 3% of Red Army soldiers ever returned home. In the East, the Germans used 10 times as many flamethrowers as they did in the West. And the flamethrower is basically a blunt instrument used largely against civilians and property. The latest German accounts cite up to 600,000 German soldiers involved in acts that contravened the Geneva Convention. And that's mostly on the Eastern Front. And as many as 50% participated in or witnessed sexual violence in the East. So it's maybe no great surprise that 4 in every 5 German soldiers killed during the war was on the Eastern Front. That's not, by the way, to say that the Western Front was a sideshow. I don't subscribe to that view at all. It's argued that the Soviets were not resilient, yet France and the lowlands fell in 6 weeks. Berlin fell in 4 days, but Leningrad lasted 3 years and Stalingrad lasted 8 months. So this is the Second World War, color, as they say, but in harsh facts. These things actually happened. After the war, there have been different generations. The one immediately after was trying to live with the experience and to forget, or at least not to question and to pick their lives up in some way. The next generation asked questions, by which time much of the evidence, except in general terms, was gone. And now there's a third generation, which is ours today, which is being forced to refight the old battles, but on a new basis and in a new way. So the various public trials that they had were supposed to draw a line under fascism, back to Eisenhower's quote, but they were inconclusive. At the trial of the Belzec death camp operatives, only 1 person was ever convicted. In Auschwitz, only 50 were ever convicted. Excuse me. The judges and civil servants effectively said we were only following the laws of the time, and none of them were convicted, nor were the bankers who benefited from slave labor. So let's look at how historical revisionism and Holocaust denial have changed. What's significant in much of this story is the degree of local collaboration. And the collaboration is at the heart of the denial and revisionism. And it's thanks to organizations like the Prague Declaration movement that has been able to so distort history that collaborators in the Holocaust have been able to rebrand themselves as victims of it. And it's moved on in leaps and bounds last 20 years, especially with the loss of the Soviet Union in 1991. Historical revisionism was illegal in the Soviet Union. Now we have a position where the European Parliament passes a revisionist motion that the Labour Party have voted for. That was in 2019. The Irving trial in 2000 meant that you could no longer deny that Hitler knew about the Holocaust. And today, if you look at the geopolitics of Europe, historical revisionism is one of the banners under which power politics is being played out. It underpins the strategy to squeeze Russia by pro-NATO forces. The Ukraine is a point in evidence now. They've created new political categories of red-brown equivalents, or communism equals fascism. And on the internet, you'll probably all have seen this one that says communism 100 million murdered. So what they're effectively doing with that is by saying, well, we know because of the Irving trial, we can't deny the Holocaust, and we don't deny the Holocaust, but your Holocaust was worse than ours. So that's this kind of what we call, excuse me, an inversion. So the Prague Declaration movement addressed itself not to historians, but to memory makers. They were going to manufacture the truth. They've broadened their message. They've widened their audience. They've made it younger. They're writing history books, printing newspapers, spending millions of euros on museums of remembrance. 4 countries stood out against the Prague Declaration: Britain, Germany, Belarus, and Russia. But right across the Eastern Crescent, in countries that have freshly signed up to membership of the EU and are enthusiastic about NATO, societies become divided over the war record and the collective memory. Each country is engaged in statue wars, street name wars, school curriculum wars, legal wars, religious wars, martyrdom wars, and political struggle. And there are museum wars as well. And the EU has now sponsored a European Day of Remembrance of the victims of communism, which coincides with the date of the German-Soviet Pact, but is an attempt to break with Holocaust Memorial Day. And across these countries in the Eastern Crescent, under the banner of historical revisionism, you've got the outlawing of the symbols of communism as a way of outlawing communist parties. Both of denial and revisionism are embedded in conspiracy theory folklore. This is a quote from Viktor Orban in Hungary. He fought in an election on the basis of, we are fighting an enemy that is different from us, not open, but hiding, not straightforward, but crafty, not honest, but base, not national, but international, does not believe in working, but speculates with money. Not very subtle, is he, really? But it's not difficult to work out what he's talking about. And the declaration plays on secret cabals setting nation against nation. And the conspiracy theory, if you like, is perfect for these countries, because it's like a religion. All you have to do is have faith in the fact that you're being deceived. And let's be honest, under capitalism, you're very likely to be being deceived. So conspiracy theory stops you looking for rational answers to world events rooted in class interest, and class struggle. So to conclude, what we're going to do about it, I think it's significant that the struggle centers on the establishment of museums of memory and school curricula. I call these the memory wars. It's really a battle for the young minds. And these people are way ahead of us. So when Michael Gove says, why do you spend so much time talking about Hitler in schools? I think we need to answer that probably we don't spend enough time arguing about it. Museums are the way that dominant ideologies tell the story as they see it. What's left in the exhibitions is important, but what's left out is equally important. And in these countries, huge sums are being spent on creating museums and manufacturing memory. And then the schools are expected to take children to those museums. And that's how they are being fed the view of the war, which is not the one that I described earlier. And of course, museums aren't just static now. They've gone digital and they've moved online. And so historical revisionism is being state-sponsored, and it's aimed specifically at the young and knitted into school teaching. If you look at the charter of the Prague Declaration movement, it spends a lot of time talking about establishing a common European legacy, which is reflected in common European curriculum in schools. Can revisionism be stopped? I think that it can be. It's a battle of ideas, so anything is possible. To fight effectively against double genocide and Holocaust inversion, we've got to bring together everybody that is threatened by fascism. And some people are going to have to learn to leave their water pistols in their holsters. Yeah. The struggle will take place on many fronts. I think there's been a really significant shift in the last 5 years of anti-revisionism, particularly in scholarship and also in book publishing. But the trouble is that the book publishing is in English and in German, and it's not in the languages of the countries that need to be having that discussion. In Spain and in France, it has been possible significantly to reverse the trend towards historical revisionism. And you have important worldwide bodies like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which brings together 46 governments committed to honest, factual documentation of what went on. And we have our own historical education, Holocaust Educational Trust, which has educated hundreds of thousands of school kids and taken thousands of post-16 school students to Auschwitz to witness exactly what really did go on. And there's plans for a Holocaust museum in Westminster. World War II is the most documented event of all time. It's not just words, but diaries, fragments, film, some of it in color. Photos, artifacts exist. Battlefields don't get up and walk off. They're a kind of living testament. And I think that we've got to hold on to those facts. The biggest contribution of the Communist Party in this battle of ideas is to develop the struggle against all forms of racism and against fascism, and to take it into the labor movement. People won to a united working class will be less susceptible to the fake news, the conspiracies and the divisions on which fascism thrives. And discussions had in trade unionized workplaces are likely to have a much greater impact than information sifted via the web when you're on your own in the front room. So I've tried to make up for my errors in the past, where I've just talked about revisionism, by giving you a glimpse of what really went on in the war and during the Holocaust, and to look at the forces behind revisionism and to show a way that we can overcome it. I just want to finish with the words of Phil Katz, who's also from Lithuania, by the way, but he's no relative, but he's a giant of a man. He says, the Holocaust represents a mind-numbing, largely incomprehensible criminality. But for us, it's also the power politics being played out behind the brutality and the assault on freedom and truth that should concern us all.